My name is Nathan, and if you spend enough time listening to stories like the one I'm about to tell you, you start to notice a pattern that has nothing to do with fingerprints or hidden cameras, or any of the things people expect. The pattern is quieter than that. It lives in the small moments a person almost lets themselves ignore. A question asked a little too casually, a drawer that locks when it never used to, a child who goes still around the one adult in the house who should feel safest. Most of us are trained to smooth those moments over, to tell ourselves we're being paranoid, to be polite. Tonight's story is about a man who didn't smooth them over. He filed them away instead, one at a time, the way a patient teacher files away answers he isn't ready to grade yet. And it's about the day a stranger in a black robe took a terrible risk to say 6 words that would save 2 lives. I want you to watch how a calm man behaves when the ground opens under him, because calm is not the same thing as weak, and observation is not the same thing as suspicion. Stay with me. This one earns every turn it takes, and it will make you trust your gut a little more when it whispers. Simon Rutledge taught 7th grade science in the town of Elmsworth, Connecticut, and he had the kind of patience that only comes from 20 years of explaining photosynthesis to 12-year-olds who would rather be anywhere else. He was 38, unhurried in a way people sometimes mistook for slowness, though his students learned quickly that the man missed nothing. He kept a lab notebook for everything, not just his classes, but his life, grades, repairs, the mileage on his old sedan, the dates his tomato seedlings sprouted. He believed that memory was a liar and that paper never was, and this small habit would one day matter more than anything he ever taught. His father, a machinist, had once told him, without looking up from the lathe, that the world forgave a man almost anything except failing to write down what he'd already learned. He noticed things in his classroom that other teachers missed. The boy who came in hungry on Mondays. The girl who flinched when a locker slammed and pretended she hadn't. Reading people, he liked to say, was just observation applied to faces instead of frog dissections. You watched for what didn't fit, then waited to understand why. The principal called him the still one, and Simon took it as a compliment, because still water, as he told his classes, is the kind you can see all the way to the bottom of. He had come to fostering almost by accident, though nothing about a lonely man's life is truly accidental. He'd wanted children since he was young, had assumed a family would simply arrive the way it did for everyone else, and then somewhere in his 30s he'd looked up and found the years had passed him like a bell he hadn't heard ring. A colleague mentioned the county's shortage of foster homes over lunch, and Simon went to an orientation on a Tuesday night, mostly to stop wondering about it. He listened to a caseworker describe children who had run out of places to go, and by the end he had quietly decided. Within a year, a small girl named Elodie came to stay with him. She was 6, with dark, serious eyes, and a stuffed fox named Pip that she carried by one ear until the ear had gone thin and gray. Her biological parents, the Larsons, had died in a highway crash when she was 4, a semi that jackknifed on black ice and took 2 ordinary people out of the world in the time it takes to gasp. The 2 years since had passed her through a chain of temporary homes, each one teaching her a little more about how not to hope. When the caseworker walked her up Simon's front steps with a garbage bag of clothes and the fox under her arm, Elodie looked at the house the way a soldier looks at new terrain, cataloging exits, and Simon recognized the look, because it wasn't so different from his own. He didn't rush her. That was the hardest discipline, because everything in him wanted to fix the sadness in a week, and he understood that a week's worth of love could feel to a wounded child like a trap. He learned that Elodie liked her toast cut into triangles and would not eat it cut into squares, that she counted stairs under her breath, 7 up and 7 down, that she went silent when adults raised their voices even in laughter. And he learned that Pip the fox had to sit facing the door at night so he could keep watch. Simon took that seriously. He put a nightlight in the hall and told her the fox now had backup. It took 4 months before she called him anything at all, and when she finally said Simon in her small flat voice, asking for more milk as if it were nothing, he had to leave the room so she wouldn't see a grown man's eyes go wet over one word. If Simon had a flaw, it was the same thing that made him kind. He wanted, badly, to belong to someone, and a man who wants that too much can be slow to question a gift that arrives wrapped exactly to fit the shape of his loneliness. He met Tabitha 8 months into fostering Elodie, at a fundraiser for the school's science wing. She was there representing a foundation, or so she said, poised and warm, and startlingly easy to talk to. She asked good questions, and, more unusually, remembered the answers. She admired what he was doing for the girl, said the word brave, in a way that landed somewhere under his ribs and stayed there. Simon, who had spent most of his adult life alone and told himself so many times that he preferred it that he'd almost believed it, found himself calling her the next week, and the week after that, feeling each time a warmth he'd assumed was no longer issued to men like him. Looking back later, he could see how neatly it had all lined up, and how the neatness itself had been the tell he missed. Tabitha had entered his life precisely when the county was pressing him about the adoption. A single foster parent could adopt, but a two-parent home moved faster, with fewer questions from the review board. She had said as much herself, gently, as if it were his idea she was merely agreeing with. "They love a stable couple," she told him over dinner, her hand warm on his. "It would be so good for Elodie, a mother and a father, a real home." That's all these boards ever want to see. At the time it sounded like love speaking. It was only later that he understood he'd been reading the wrong text entirely, admiring the handwriting while missing the message, and that the message had been an itinerary all along. They married quietly 11 months after they met. A small ceremony with a justice of the peace and a modest cake Elodie helped choose, insisting on lemon with a 6-year-old's unshakable authority. There were off notes even then, if Simon had let himself listen. Tabitha's past was strangely smooth, a life described in wide, confident strokes, with no rough edges, no old friends who called on birthdays, no photographs older than a few years. When he asked once about her family, she said her parents had passed and she'd been on her own a long time, and something in her face closed like a door easing shut, and he, being a polite man raised by a private one, had not knocked again. Simon wrote the date of the wedding in his notebook, and in the margin, without quite knowing why, "She doesn't like to be asked twice about herself." He underlined it once and moved on, trusting he'd circle back when he knew more. He always circled back. That was the thing about Simon. He never lost a page. The adoption of Elodie was not the only thing riding on the paperwork that would be finalized that autumn, though Simon understood only half of what was at stake, and Tabitha understood all of it. When the Larsons died on that stretch of black ice, the wrongful death suit against the trucking company had settled for a little over $2 million, placed in an irrevocable trust for their only child. Elodie could not touch it for years, not until she was grown and its terms unlocked in careful stages. But the trust needed a hand at the wheel until then, and by its own terms that hand belonged to the child's legal guardians the moment an adoption made them permanent. Simon knew the trust existed. Cecilia Alderman, the family lawyer he'd hired to shepherd the adoption, had walked him through the basics. $2 million, held for the child, guardians as trustees, distributions for her care and education. He'd filed it away as a thing to be scrupulous about, the way you're careful with a child's future. He never once thought of it as money that could be his. It was Elodie's, full stop, the way the fox was Elodie's. To Tabitha, it was the only thing in the house that was real. She had done the arithmetic before she ever learned the color of Simon's eyes. $2 million now, a life insurance policy she'd install on Simon later, and a compliant, damaged little girl who could be moved to a new state and a new name once the paperwork was signed and the husband was gone. She had, after all, done a version of it before. The home study went beautifully, which should have been Simon's first real warning, because nothing involving a county bureaucracy goes beautifully by accident. Tabitha handled the visits like a woman hosting a dinner she'd rehearsed for a week, the good candles lit, cookies fresh from an oven she'd timed to be baking as the caseworker knocked. She spoke about Elodie with a tenderness so convincing that Winifred Achebe, the child's guardian ad litem, wrote glowing notes for 2 visits running. Then, on the 3rd, something small began to bother her. Win had spent 15 years watching adults perform love for clipboards, and she'd developed an ear for the difference between a mother's warmth and an excellent impression of one. She noticed that Tabitha's affection always seemed aimed a few degrees off, at the observer rather than the child. The tender words delivered to Win's face and not to Elodie's. And she noticed that Elodie, when Tabitha reached to smooth her hair, went very still, the exact stillness of Simon's students when a locker slammed, a stillness that has nothing to do with calm. There was a man who came to the house sometimes, whom Tabitha introduced as Anders Whitby, a financial friend, helping the family get their affairs in order before the adoption. He was smooth in a way Simon didn't warm to, a man who wore his watch a little loose so it slid on his wrist when he gestured, who laughed a half-second before anything was funny, who called Simon chief with a familiarity they had not earned. Anders talked about protecting the family's future, about wills and beneficiaries, and the responsible things a new father really ought to have in place. It all sounded reasonable. Everything Anders said sounded reasonable, which was, Simon would later realize, precisely the problem, because a con is not a lie badly told. It is a truth arranged to point the wrong way, a set of true facts stacked so a reasonable man walks off the edge of them, believing he's on solid ground. Small things collected, and Simon, unable to stop himself, collected them right back. Tabitha began asking about his life insurance, whether the modest policy through the school district was really enough for a family man now, whether he'd thought about what would happen to Elodie if something happened to him. She asked it with a wife's soft concern, over coffee, more than once, circling the topic the way a moth circles a lamp. He noticed, too, that a drawer in the study desk had begun to lock, a cheap side drawer that had held nothing but old warranties and takeout menus, and that Tabitha now kept a small brass key on the ring with her car keys, a key he had never seen before the drawer changed. He didn't confront her. Confrontation ended observation, and Simon had learned long ago that the fastest way to stop learning something is to let the other person know you're looking. So he wrote none of it where she might find it, and all of it where he could. What unsettled him most, though he could not have justified it to any judge alive, was Elodie. One night, tucking her in, he asked lightly if she was happy that Mommy Tabitha was going to be her mommy forever. The girl looked not at him but at the fox on her pillow. She reached out and turned Pip a careful 1/4 inch so it faced the door more squarely, and said, in a small, even voice, "Pip doesn't like when she does the pretend voice." Simon went very careful. He asked, gently, what pretend voice that was, and Elodie only pulled the blanket to her chin and said, looking at the door and not at him, "The one for when you're home." Then she closed her eyes, done with the subject. Simon sat in the dark hallway a long time after that, feeling the whole shape of his life shift 1/2 inch on its foundation. In the morning he wrote it in the notebook, word for word, with the date. He did not know yet what it meant. He only knew his daughter had told him something true, in the sideways way children tell the truest things, and that a father's whole job, boiled down past the toast and the nightlights, was to hear the true thing even when he couldn't yet understand it. The adoption finalization was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October at the Elmsworth County Family Courthouse, a squat brick building with radiators that knocked like something trapped in the walls. To Simon, it was the finish line of 2 years of waiting, the day Elodie would legally and permanently become his daughter. He bought her a small dress the color of a robin's egg and let her pick out clip-on earrings shaped like ladybugs, which she chose with the same grave authority she'd chosen lemon cake. She insisted on bringing Pip, and privately he was glad, because a small, foolish part of him wanted the fox's counsel in that room too. The morning was clear and cold, frost still silvering the lawns. Simon woke early and made toast in triangles and sat with Elodie while she ate and swung her legs, and asked whether she'd have to call the judge, "Sir." He said probably "Your Honor," and she practiced it under her breath until she landed on a tone she approved of. Tabitha came down in a gray dress that photographed like trust itself, and kissed the top of Elodie's head in a way that made the girl set down her toast mid-bite and go still, and told the room the day was going to be absolutely perfect. Simon watched his wife check her reflection in the hall mirror the way an actor checks a mark, a small, precise smoothing of the face into its role, and he felt, for no reason he could name yet, the cold current a swimmer feels when the water changes temperature around his legs, and he doesn't yet know what's beneath him. At the courthouse they were joined by Cecilia Alderman, brisk in a navy suit, who wordlessly handed Simon a coffee, and by Winifred Achebe, who crouched to give Elodie a wink, and Pip a very serious 2-fingered handshake. Anders Whitby was there too, unasked, seated a row behind Tabitha, and Simon noted his presence without comment, filing it beside the drawer and the pretend voice. And at the front, beneath a faded state seal, sat Judge Rademacher, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the tired, kind, unshakable face of someone who had spent 30 years watching families be made and broken in front of him. He would not have looked, to anyone in that room, like a man about to do the single bravest thing he had ever done. What no one in that courtroom knew, what Simon would only piece together later, was that Judge Rademacher had not always sat in family court. Years earlier, in another county, he had presided over the settlement of an estate, that of a man named Edmund Ashgrove who had died falling from the roof of his own lake house. He had signed off on the disbursement to the grieving widow, had looked at her tasteful grief across his courtroom, and found nothing to hold, and had felt ever after a small, cold splinter of doubt. He had seen that widow's face once, for an afternoon. And a judge who has spent 30 years reading faces does not forget the one that ever made him uneasy in a way he couldn't name. Rademacher began the way he always did, with the small courtesies that make a courtroom feel less like a machine grinding through lives. He asked Elodie if she knew why she was there, and she said, "To be adopted, Your Honor." And a soft, warm laugh went around the room. He complimented the ladybug earrings and asked, gravely, whether the fox had a name, and when Elodie whispered, "Pip," he nodded, as if it were exactly the right name for a fox. He told Simon the court had reviewed the home study and the guardian's reports, and that everything appeared, glancing over his glasses, beautifully in order. Simon's chest loosened at those words, the held breath of 2 years going slowly out of him. He let himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply be happy. Then the judge began to read the file properly, and Simon watched, because Simon always watched, and so Simon was the first person in that room to see the exact moment it happened. It was not dramatic. Rademacher turned pages with the unhurried competence of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. He turned to a page near the front, where a photograph Tabitha had submitted for the home study was clipped, and the old man simply went still on it. His eyes returned to the same spot twice, 3 times, as if the page failed to resolve. His reading glasses came down onto his nose. He turned a page forward, then back to the photograph, then forward again, and then Judge Rademacher's hands, which had been perfectly steady for the whole proceeding, began, very slightly, to shake. The room hadn't noticed yet. Tabitha wore her courtroom smile, serene and maternal, hands folded in her gray lap. Cecilia was arranging her own copies, but Simon had gone cold all over, because he knew that stillness. He had felt it in his own chest 3 times that autumn, over a locked drawer and a repeated question and a fox turned to face a door, and he understood, with the certainty of a man who reads faces for a living, that whatever the judge had just seen had done to Rademacher exactly what those small things had done to him. The judge looked up. His eyes found Simon's and held them, steady over the trembling hands, and something passed between the 2 men that had no words in it yet, only weight. "Mr. Rutledge," the judge said, his voice even, professional, giving nothing to the room. "Before we proceed, there's a procedural matter I need to confirm with you directly. Would you approach the bench, please? Just you." Cecilia half rose, the trained reflex of a good attorney whose client is being singled out. "Your Honor, if there's an issue with the filing." "It's administrative, counsel." Rademacher's mildness did not invite argument. 2 minutes, please, be seated." Simon rose. He felt every eye settle onto his back, felt Tabitha's smile turn a single cool degree as it tracked him. He crossed to the bench and leaned in, and Rademacher covered the microphone with one broad hand and bent down until his face was inches from Simon's, close enough that Simon could see the bead of sweat at his hairline and the tremor still working in his fingers. What the judge said, so quietly that not even the clerk 3 feet away could catch a syllable, was this: "Don't sign anything today, and divorce your wife immediately. Take the child and go, today." For a moment the words simply would not compute, the way a sentence in your own language can arrive scrambled when your mind refuses to hold it. Simon kept his face perfectly neutral, the old teacher's discipline that had carried him through 100 crises in front of watching children, and said, just as quietly, barely moving his lips, "What are you saying to me?" "I can't say it out loud in this room." The judge's eyes flicked, once, fast, past Simon's shoulder toward the gallery, toward the poised woman in gray, and the loose-watched man behind her, and came back. "There are people in this room I will not say it in front of. Do you understand me, son? I am not able to protect you inside this courtroom, but I can tell you to read." He slid the file an inch across the bench, his thumb pressing a place near the middle. "There is something stapled behind page 12. Read it before you sign one single word. Ask for a recess, but you read that first." Then he straightened, and in a completely normal voice, the mild voice of a man confirming a mailing address, said, "Thank you, Mr. Rutledge. Take your seat. Counsel, let's take a brief recess, 15 minutes, so the parties can review the complete file. The clerk will provide copies." Simon walked back with the file's edge seeming to burn against his palm, and he did not let his face change, not even when Tabitha leaned in and touched his forearm and murmured, "What on earth was that about, darling?" And he heard it then, consciously, for the first time, unmistakable now that his daughter had named it for him weeks ago in the dark. The pretend voice. The warm one for when you're home. "Just paperwork," he said, and smiled at her, and it was the single hardest thing his face had ever been asked to do. The recess emptied the courtroom into a narrow hallway. Simon told Cecilia he needed a few minutes alone with the file to check its dates against his own records, the kind of thorough thing everyone who knew him expected, and so no one questioned it, least of all Tabitha, who had come to find his fussiness reassuringly harmless. He carried the file to a wooden bench at the far end of the corridor and turned to page 12. Down the hall, Tabitha stood speaking low and fast with Anders Whitby, and Simon noted, in the cold corner of his mind that never fully switched off, that they stood a few inches too close for a woman and her financial friend, and that Anders's hand had come to rest at the small of her back, with the unthinking ease of a very old habit. Then Simon turned page 12 over, and he stopped noticing anything else in the world at all. Stapled behind page 12, tucked where nothing in an adoption file should ever have lived, were two documents. The first was a life insurance application on Simon's own life, in the amount of $900,000, bearing a signature that was almost, but not quite, his own. The confident forgery of someone who had watched him sign 100 permission slips. The named beneficiary, sole and irrevocable, was Tabitha Rutledge. The application was dated 3 weeks earlier. Simon had never seen it, had never filled out a line of it. He thought, with an eerie floating detachment, of the locked side drawer, of the brass key riding on her car ring, of Anders tapping a brochure and saying the word beneficiary as if it were a kindness, and the pieces slid together with a click he felt in the roots of his teeth. The second document was worse, and it was the one the judge had truly meant. It was a single sheet, a court administrative flag, the automatic kind the system generates when a name pings against a sealed record, clipped to this file whether by clerical accident or some anonymous act of conscience Simon would never learn. It noted, in flat gray language, that the identity Tabitha Rutledge was associated, through a matched identity trace and a fingerprint flag, with a sealed estate matter out of another county, several years old. The name on that sealed matter was Marlena Ashgrove, and beside it was a notation that the estate had been settled following the accidental death of one Edmund Ashgrove, spouse, with the surviving spouse as beneficiary of a substantial life insurance policy, after which the surviving spouse's whereabouts had become unknown. Simon sat very still as the water he told his students they could see all the way to the bottom of, and he understood everything at once, the whole architecture standing up in his mind fully built. His wife was not his wife. She was a woman named Marlena Ashgrove, who had years ago married a man named Edmund, insured his life, and collected when Edmund died in an accident that the word accident had been doing an enormous quiet amount of work to describe. And she had set out to do the identical thing again, with him, only larger, because this time there was not merely a policy waiting for him to die. This time there was a $2 million trust that would drop neatly into her control the instant a judge said, "Granted," and a small watchful girl she needed only long enough to reach it. Simon was the father the adoption required, and the moment the ink was dry, Simon was scenery to be struck. He looked up once, at the poised woman laughing softly at something the loose-watched man had said, entirely at ease, and he thought, with a calm so total it frightened him more than panic would have, she was never once going to let me grow old. He did not confront her. That single discipline, held against every screaming instinct, is the reason he is alive to have this story told. Everything in him built for fairness wanted to cross that hallway and say the name Marlena Ashgrove out loud and watch her lovely, composed face come apart. But Simon had spent 20 years learning that the moment you show your hand, the lesson stops, and the other person starts writing the ending. So he closed the file, squared its edges out of habit, and walked to where Cecilia stood by the coffee machine, and said, very quietly, "Cecilia, I'm not signing today. I need you to trust me and not ask a single question where anyone can hear it. I'm withdrawing the petition, and I'm taking my daughter home, right now." Cecilia had been a family lawyer for 19 years, long enough to know the difference between a parent's cold feet and a man who has just seen the bottom drop out of the world. She looked at his face for one full second and did not ask. "Go get the child," she said. "I'll handle the judge and the paperwork. Go." Elodie was in the small witness room off the hall with Winifred Achebe, showing Pip the ladybug earrings. Simon crouched to her level and made his voice the ordinary voice, the toast in triangles voice, the one that had never once lied to her. "Hey, Bug, little change of plans. The judge needs more time to do the boring grown-up paperwork, so you and me are gonna go get pancakes today and come back and finish another day. That sound okay?" Elodie studied him with her dark, serious eyes, the eyes that had learned in a garbage bag of clothes to read a room for exits. Then she looked down at Pip and reached out and turned the fox a quarter inch so it faced the door, and said, "Okay, is Mommy Tabitha coming with us?" And Simon said, gently, giving nothing, "Not today," and something in the girl's narrow shoulders came down, a small easing, and he understood in that instant that she had been carrying the same weight he had all this time, only in the dark and alone, and had never once had the words to set it down. Winifred watched the whole exchange, watched the shoulders drop, and quietly picked up her bag and coat. "I'll walk you out," she said. It was not a question, and Simon was grateful past speaking that it wasn't. They went out a side door into the cold, clean October light, and Simon buckled his daughter into the back of the old sedan with hands that only allowed themselves to shake once the belt was clicked and she couldn't see. Tabitha called his phone as he pulled out of the lot. He watched her name light up the screen, the name that wasn't her name, and did not answer. Behind him, a poised woman in a gray dress was beginning, slowly, to understand that her husband had just walked out with the only two things she needed in the world, and that she had no idea why. Simon drove the speed limit exactly, both because it was his nature and because he had just become a man who could not afford to be stopped. He kept one hand reaching back to rest on the small, worn toe of Elodie's shoe, and he did not go home. He went instead to a motel 2 towns over, paid cash, and got a room with 2 double beds and a door that locked with a chain he checked twice. It was the beginning of the hardest 6 weeks of his life, and also of the education that would undo Marlena Ashgrove completely. Because Simon had done the one thing she had never planned for. He had left the game board mid-move, with all the pieces in his coat pocket, and he had sat down at a cheap laminate desk under a bad lamp and started, in his patient teacher's hand, to take notes. That first night, with Elodie asleep in the far bed and Pip on guard facing the chained door, Simon built a timeline. He took out his own worn notebooks, the ones Tabitha had smiled at and dismissed as a harmless tick, and wrote down every date he could prove or remember. The day he first met her, 8 months into fostering Elodie, right as the county pressure was mounting. The day she first floated a 2-parent home. The day Anders first appeared with his brochures. The day the study drawer began to lock. The day she first asked about his life insurance. And the day she asked again. And the day she asked a 3rd time. Laid out with dates beside them, the pattern stopped looking anything like a marriage and started looking like a project schedule. Every single thing Tabitha had done had been timed against the adoption calendar, each move made precisely as another gate on the trust swung into view. He was not looking at a woman who had fallen in love and gone cold. He was looking at a plan, and he had been its central load-bearing beam, essential and admired right up until the moment the roof was framed and the beam was in the way of the view. In the gray of the next morning, he called Cecilia from a prepaid phone he'd bought at a gas station, feeling faintly absurd and entirely certain, and told her all of it. The insurance application with the almost right signature, the flag naming Marlena Ashgrove, the sealed estate, Edmund's roof, and the word accident. Cecilia was quiet a long moment. Then she said, in the voice of a lawyer who has to hurt you a little to help you, "Simon, I need to say the thing you already know. That flag was stapled into your file by mistake. It's sealed, and by the book it should never have touched your hands. The insurance application is powerful evidence of forgery, but a sharp defense attorney will say you manufactured it yourself, an angry husband on the eve of a divorce. Right now we don't have a case. We have a direction." Simon had expected precisely this. "Then let's build the case," he said, watching Elodie sleep. "Tell me where I start." And Cecilia, who had by now privately decided she would follow this soft-spoken, unshakable man off a cliff, said, "You don't start. You hand it to people who can carry it in a courtroom. But before anything else, we protect the child. Because the second Tabitha understands that you know, that little girl stops being a daughter to her and becomes the only card she has left to play, and she will play it." That was where Winifred Achebe earned a place in this story that no one will ever engrave on a plaque. As Elodie's guardian ad litem, Win was the one adult in the entire apparatus whose sole legal purpose was the child's welfare and no one else's, and she had been quietly uneasy for months. When Simon laid the whole thing out for her in a diner booth 2 towns from anywhere, with Elodie coloring placemats, Win did not flinch and did not gush. She asked 3 short, sharp questions, the kind only someone who has seen the worst of families knows to ask, and when Simon's answers held up under all 3, she said simply, "I believe you. And more to the point, I can act on it." Within a single day, Win had done the quiet bureaucratic things that would matter more than any dramatic gesture. She flagged Elodie's file so that no emergency custody transfer could be processed without her personal sign-off, and documented Simon's home as the child's established psychological placement. She built, out of nothing but paperwork and 15 years of hard-won instinct, an invisible wall around a 6-year-old, a wall that Marlena Ashgrove was going to run straight into at full speed and break herself upon. And it was Judge Rademacher, through the most careful and deniable of back channels, who at last gave Simon the one name that would turn a direction into a case. The judge could not touch this himself, or the whole thing would detonate into a scandal about a sitting judge who had whispered to a litigant across his own bench, and every scrap would be thrown out, and Marlena would walk free with the girl. But a message reached Cecilia, unsigned, routed through a retired colleague, suggesting only that a certain Detective Ridgway of the state police, a man who years ago had never been satisfied with how the Edmund Ashgrove file was closed, might be very interested to learn that a particular old name had just surfaced again in a new county. Simon never met the judge again, but he thought of him constantly, and years later, understanding in full what the old man had gambled that Thursday, his career and his pension against 6 whispered words for a stranger, he would drive to the courthouse on the anniversary and sit in the parking lot a while, just a quiet man being grateful. Detective Ridgway turned out to be a lean, weathered man who spoke slowly and listened faster than he spoke. He had been a young investigator when Edmund Ashgrove died, and it had been his first case that felt wrong in a way he couldn't prove. A healthy 50-year-old man had, the story went, fallen from the flat roof of his own lake house while adjusting a satellite dish in a stiff autumn wind. Ridgway had never liked it. The angle of the fall was wrong for a man reaching upward. The reason to be on the roof at all was thin. And the grieving widow had been memorably organized about the paperwork, filing the substantial insurance claim with a briskness that suggested she had read the policy more than twice. But there had been no physical evidence, only the wrongness, and wrongness does not reopen a closed case. The widow had collected and vanished, and the file had gone into a drawer in Ridgway's memory where it had sat for years, quietly itching. When Cecilia's careful call finally came, the detective was silent a long moment, and then said the words that meant Marlena Ashgrove's long luck had at last run out. "Send me everything you have," he said. "I have been waiting a lot of years to hear that name again." The case came together the way Simon's students learned real science, one careful observation at a time, each piece unimpressive alone, the whole thing undeniable only once laid side by side in the right order. Ridgway lawfully pulled the sealed Ashgrove estate file and set the old surviving spouse photograph beside a courthouse security still of Tabitha Rutledge from that October morning. The woman in the older picture wore darker hair and answered to a different name, but the architecture of the face was the same, and a forensic comparison closed the last of the gap. Then he traced the money, following Edmund's insurance payout through a patient series of accounts that thinned and split and reconsolidated, the classic slow churn of laundered money, until it pooled, years down the line, inside a small registered entity whose listed agent turned out to be one Anders Whitby. That single thread named the second player and reframed the entire story. Anders was not a charming financial acquaintance Marlena had picked up around Elmsworth. He was her partner, and had been for years, an estates and insurance fixer who specialized in precisely this, the cold paperwork of engineered grief. He forged the clean new identities that let her become Tabitha, structured the policies so they'd pay without a fight, and collected his share once the accidents had happened and the checks had cleared. Marlena found the lonely men and made them love her. Anders made the deaths pay out. They had done it before, at least once anyone could now prove, and had been weeks from doing it again, and the only reason they hadn't was a bead of sweat on an old judge's forehead and a stapler in a clerk's office that had, for once, misfired in the direction of justice. It was around the fourth week that Tabitha understood the ground had shifted, and she turned, exactly as Cecilia had warned, dangerous. She could not yet know how much Simon had, but she could count, and the count was bad. Her husband had not come home. He had not signed. He had lawyered up and gone quiet, and worst of all, he had put the child somewhere she could not even locate. So Marlena did what her kind always does the instant charm stops opening doors. She reached for the machinery of the system itself and set out to turn it into a weapon. Through her own attorney, she filed an emergency motion for custody of Elodie, and it was, Simon had to admit when Cecilia read it aloud, a masterful piece of work. It painted a fragile, obsessive husband who had suffered a breakdown, snatched a vulnerable foster child out of a courtroom against a judge's clear wishes, and fled with her into hiding. Every fact in it was technically true, and every one had been arranged to point exactly the wrong way, which was, of course, the whole family business. She cast herself as the frantic, abandoned mother, and Simon as the unstable man, and to any judge who came to it cold, it would read as a coin flip. It should have worked. What stopped it dead was the wall Winifred Achebe had quietly built weeks earlier, when there was no drama and no audience. Because Elodie's file now required Wynn's personal sign-off on any transfer, the emergency motion could not be rubber-stamped by an overworked night clerk before anyone who knew better woke up. It landed instead on Wynn's desk, precisely where the wall had been designed to route it, and Wynn did not process it. She walked it, in person, into the chambers of a judge she had known for a decade, laid beside it the growing bones of Ridgway's file, and said the sentence that changed the temperature of the entire matter in a single breath. Your Honor, before you even think about ruling to hand this child back to that woman, there is an open homicide reclassification you need to know about, and the child's father is the cooperating witness. The motion was stayed on the spot. And Simon, when he heard, learned the lesson he would carry longest of all, that the boring, invisible act of building a wall around the people you love, before you can even prove you'll need it, is the single truest form of protection there is. There was one very bad night, in the 5th week, the near-miss Simon would go on waking from in a cold sweat for years. He had allowed himself and Elodie a single carefully arranged trip back into town, to let the girl see her friend Wynn, and to collect documents from Cecilia's office. Anders Whitby had been quietly watching that office, betting a devoted father would eventually surface there. Simon came out through the glass doors with Elodie's hand warm in his, and saw, across the street, a familiar loose-watched man rise from a parked car and start toward them with a wide, easy smile and both hands lifting, calling, "Simon! Oh, thank God, we've all been so worried sick, come here." And Simon felt the shape of the trap close before Anders had taken 3 steps. The plan to manufacture a warm public scene, to get the child near that parked car, to create a single confusing moment that could be spun 100 ways. But Simon had spent 5 weeks becoming a man who woke each morning assuming he was being hunted. He did not run, because running would have painted him exactly as guilty as the motion claimed, and he did not argue, because a shouting match was precisely the scene Anders needed. Instead, Simon simply turned, calm as an ordinary Tuesday, and walked Elodie directly back in through the glass doors he'd just left. where 3 witnesses and a security camera now stood between the little girl and the smiling man, and said, pitched exactly loud enough for that camera's microphone, "Anders Whitby is approaching my daughter and me, and I am declining all contact." Anders stopped short at the doors. He was a fixer, not a fool, and he understood in 1 second that this was no longer a place a man like him could operate in daylight. He held the smile a beat too long, let it fall, then turned and walked away. And Simon stood just inside the glass with his daughter's face pressed hard into his coat, her whole body trembling, and understood that his flat, unhurried calm had accomplished the one thing panic never could have. It had kept the door between his child and that man shut. The evidence very nearly slipped away regardless. Ridgway needed the original insurance application on Simon's life, not the photocopy behind page 12, because only an original could carry latent fingerprints and the tiny betraying variations of a forger's pen pressure. And the original, Simon was nearly certain, still lived in the locked side drawer in the study of the house he no longer dared enter, behind a brass key that rode on Marlena's own ring. If she ran, that paper would go into her bag or into a fire. Ridgway moved to build a warrant, but warrants take days, and days were the one thing a cornered woman would never willingly give. In the end, it came down to a matter of hours, and to the last thing anyone would have expected to decide a murder case, which was a threadbare stuffed fox. Simon, turning his notebooks over in the dark, had remembered something Elodie said weeks before, when he'd thought it nothing more than a child's chatter. The girl had mentioned, in the sideways way children hand you the most important things while looking at something else, that Mommy Tabitha keeps her secret papers in the desk, and she thinks I don't know the key hides under the fish. There was a small, ugly ceramic fish on the study windowsill Simon had walked past, absently 1,000 times. He called Ridgway and told him. The detective, executing the warrant the hour it cleared the judge's signature, went straight to that windowsill, lifted the fish, and found beneath its cool, hollow belly a spare brass key. And in the drawer that key opened, undisturbed because Marlena had believed no living soul knew it was there, he found the original forged application, complete with latents, a second, larger, still unfiled policy application, and a slim folder of documents in the name Marlena Ashgrove she had been too proud, or too rushed, to destroy. A frightened 6-year-old's offhand sentence, kept by a father who threw nothing out, turned out to be the exact hinge on which the entire case at last swung shut. The reckoning, when it finally came, did not look anything like the movies, and Simon was quietly glad of that, because he had never once wanted a scene. He had wanted only the truth, arranged at last so that it pointed the right way, and that is a far quieter and more devastating thing than any shouting. It came together over a single cold week in December, undeniable once you finally noticed it had already, invisibly, happened. Detective Ridgway's forensic re-examination of Edmund Ashgrove's death was the keystone. With the sealed file now lawfully reopened, a fresh review of the old autopsy photographs and the geometry of that lake house roofline, by a biomechanical expert Ridgway trusted, concluded exactly what a young investigator's gut had insisted upon years before. The pattern of Edmund's injuries was inconsistent with a fall while reaching upward toward a satellite dish, and consistent instead with a fall that had followed a blow. It was not, standing alone, a murder conviction, but set beside the insurance timeline, the vanished widow, the forged identities, and now a nearly identical scheme caught red-handed against a second husband 2 states and several years later. It was more than enough to move. Edmund Ashgrove's death was reclassified from accidental to homicide, and for the first time since he had gone off that roof, a dead man had someone speaking on his behalf. The fraud case against Marlena and Anders was, as Cecilia put it with grim satisfaction, the cleanest thing I've seen in 19 years, because the 2 of them built it themselves and left it lying around. The recovered original application on Simon's life carried Anders Whitby's fingerprints on its reverse, and a pen pressure analysis that matched exemplars of his handwriting. He had forged Simon's signature with his own hand. The money trail from Edmund's payout to the shell entity in Anders's name tied the 2 of them together across years and 2 states. The folder of documents in the name Marlena Ashgrove ended forever the fiction that Tabitha Rutledge was anyone real, and the second, larger, unfiled application, meant to raise the payout on Simon's coming death, established the one thing prosecutors always need most and get least: intent, in the conspirators' own handwriting, to do the whole thing again. They arrested Anders Whitby first, quietly, at his table in a restaurant, and he did the thing fixers always do the moment the structure they've built fails on them. He talked. Faced with a homicide conspiracy exposure that could bury him for the rest of his life, Anders traded everything he had for a lighter road, and his account blew the last of the fog away. He described how Marlena selected her marks: lonely men with assets, or, better still, lonely men with children who came attached to trusts, and how the deaths were designed to read as accidents. And he described, in cold detail, the conversations the two of them had already had about Simon, about the roof of Simon's life, about the schedule. His testimony turned a strong fraud case into an airtight one and gave the reopened Ashgrove homicide a living voice. There is, Simon thought when he heard, a fitting justice in a scheme built on a secret affair being finally brought down by the weaker, more frightened half of that same affair. Marlena Ashgrove was arrested at the house, in a gray dress, packing a single efficient suitcase. She had understood by then that it was over, and she did the one thing Simon had known all along she would do when both her charm and her machinery failed, which was to feel precisely nothing for anyone but herself. There was no confession, no tears, only a cold, level silence, and then, as Ridgway read her the real name, a single small flicker of something that looked almost like relief, as if the long labor of being 3 different women in 3 towns had finally been set down. She was charged with the murder of Edmund Ashgrove, with conspiracy, insurance fraud, multiple counts of forgery, and the attempted scheme against the life of Simon Rutledge. Anders Whitby was charged as her co-conspirator. Neither of them, the prosecutors made quietly clear, would be seeing the free side of a courtroom door again for a very long time. The one confrontation Simon could not avoid, and did not try to, was the day he took the stand, and it was the closest the whole story ever came to the scene he had spent months refusing to give her. She sat across the courtroom, poised even in custody, and when Simon settled into the witness chair, she turned the old warmth on him, full and deliberate, the pretend voice made visible on her face. One last appeal to a man she still believed she could read and move. But Simon had read her first, and longer, and far more truly than she had ever read him. He gave his testimony the exact way he graded a lab report, precise, unhurried, entirely without heat, laying each documented date and each preserved note beside the next in order, until the pattern simply stood there, finished, for the whole room to see and be unable to unsee. He never once raised his voice. When the prosecutor asked, near the end, how he had known to look behind page 12, Simon was quiet a moment, and then said only, "A man I will always owe a debt to told me to read before I signed anything. So I read." And Marlena Ashgrove watched the calm, patient, ordinary science teacher she had chosen, precisely because she'd judged him too gentle to ever be a threat, and finally understood that his gentleness had never for 1 second been weakness. It had been the deep patience of a man who was always, quietly, and without ever letting her see it, taking notes. The aftermath was slow and undramatic, the way real healing almost always is, and Simon would not have traded a single gray minute of it. Marlena Ashgrove was convicted on the fraud and forgery counts, and then, faced with the reclassified homicide, Anders's cooperating testimony, and a biomechanical expert waiting for the jury, she pleaded to the killing of Edmund Ashgrove rather than gamble on a trial, and was sentenced to a term that would comfortably outlast any use she could ever have found for a $2 million trust. Anders Whitby, for his cooperation, received a lesser but still substantial sentence, the fixer paying less than the architect but paying all the same. The 2 fraudulent policies were voided, and Edmund Ashgrove, a man Simon had never met and never would, got at long last the thing the dead so rarely receive, which is the truth spoken plainly aloud in a room of living people with his name on the door. The adoption was done over, from the beginning, cleanly, the following spring, with Simon as Elodie's sole legal parent. There was a new hearing, in a sunnier courtroom, and this time when the judge read through the file, there were no shaking hands anywhere in the room, only the ordinary machinery of a good thing happening to 2 people who had earned it. Winifred Achebe was there, in the front row. Cecilia Alderman was there, for once not billing for it. and Detective Ridgway sat quietly in the very back, in a suit that did not quite fit across the shoulders, having asked Simon, gruffly, whether it would be all right if he came. Elodie wore the ladybug earrings again, and brought Pip, and when the judge asked whether she understood why she was there, she said, clear as a bell, "To be adopted for real this time, Your Honor," and the whole room, the bailiff and the clerk and the detective in the bad suit included, had to look down at the floor a moment and find something to do with their faces. The trust was made secure, its terms rewritten, so it could never again become a reason for anyone to want the girl instead of simply love her, held safe until Elodie was grown enough to decide the shape of her own life with it. Judge Rademacher was not in that second, sunlit courtroom, and Simon understood exactly why, and honored the silence of it. But some months later, a plain white envelope arrived at Simon's new house with no return address, and inside was a single short note in an old man's careful hand. It said only, "I have signed 10,000 orders in my years, and lost sleep over more than a few of them. I will sleep well about yours. Be good to her." Simon read it twice, standing in his own kitchen, and then he put it, folded, into the notebook, alongside the drugstore receipt for a pair of ladybug earrings, and Elodie's first crayon drawing of a house with 3 windows, and a fox in one of them, and every date that had ever truly mattered, because some things a man keeps on paper precisely so that memory, which is a liar, can never once take them from him. They moved, in the end, to a smaller and quieter town a good distance from Elmsworth, and Simon went back to the thing he was made for, teaching 7th grade science to children who would rather be anywhere else. Elodie grew. The pretend voice stillness left her by slow inches, the way frost leaves a lawn, until one entirely ordinary Tuesday morning, Simon stood in her doorway and realized, with a jolt that stopped his breath, that he could not remember the last night she had turned Pip to face the door. She had, at some point he'd missed, decided this house was finally safe enough to sleep in, with her back to the world and her face to the wall. That single quiet thing, more than any verdict any judge ever read, was the moment Simon Rutledge knew for certain that they had won. And Pip the fox, his long watch finally over, was allowed at last, for the first time in the whole of his gray and thin-eared life, to simply face the pillows and rest. My name is Nathan, and I've told you a great many stories, but this one stays lodged in me for a reason I want to leave in your hands before you go. We like to imagine that the people who save us will be dramatic about it, that rescue arrives loud, kicking the door in. But look, really look, at who actually saved this little girl. A judge who found, at the last possible second, the courage for 6 whispered words, and then stepped back into the shadows and asked for no credit, and got none. A caseworker who quietly built a paper wall around a child, weeks before anyone could prove a storm was coming. A tired detective who never once stopped being bothered by a case he couldn't close. And a soft-spoken science teacher whose only real superpower was that he wrote things down and flatly refused to explain away what his own eyes and his own daughter were telling him. Not one of them ever raised their voice. Here is the takeaway I would bury under your floorboards and keep. The most dangerous people in this world are almost never the ones who feel wrong the first time you meet them. They are the ones who feel perfect, who arrive exactly when you need them and fit exactly the shape of the hole in your life. Because that fit is not always luck. Sometimes that fit is design. Simon's gut whispered to him for months, in the language of a locked drawer and a pretend voice and a child going still. And the one thing that saved his life is that he never argued with the whisper. He didn't demand proof before he started paying attention. He just stopped telling himself he was imagining it. So if some small quiet part of you keeps circling back to one wrong thing that everyone insists is nothing, don't smooth it over just to be polite. Write it down. Watch. And when a stranger takes a terrible risk to warn you, for God's sake, read what's stapled behind page 12. I'm Nathan. Trust the whisper. I'll see you in the next one.